everyone, and welcome back. It is finally time for the next installment of my fabric series, where we're going to be talking about linen. Now, I put this up for a vote on my Patreon, and linen and wool were in a dead heat, but linen just barely won out at the time that I took count, so that's what we're going with today, but they are both well-loved fibers for very good reasons. Unfortunately though, linen tends to get a bit of a bad reputation when it comes to care. So we're going to dig into some of those misconceptions and try to get a better understanding of what exactly is linen and why is it such a useful fiber. But first, I want to go ahead and take this moment to thank the sponsor of my video this week, Magellan TV. Magellan TV is a new video streaming service full of documentaries that was founded by a team of filmmakers. Their library of options is full of history content from ancient to modern day, not to mention science, space, dinosaurs, and even true crime. It opens up a world waiting to be explored. I've fallen down a rabbit hole of archaeological content which encompasses a wide range of eras and locations. In particular, I really enjoyed Enigma of the Celtic Tomb, which looks at a grave and surrounding city site from 2,500 years ago, located in Lavaux, France. It showcases the jewelry, urns, and objects that were studied in multiple Celtic sites, which helps bring us closer to eras where we have so little material culture information left, and personally closer to the site and objects than I could ever hope to experience in real life. Magellan TV's library is growing rapidly, and I am always finding new titles to add to my watch list. So if you want to explore the world around you, both past and present, click the link below to get your first month free and you'll be discovering all that Magellan TV has to offer instantly. Thanks again to Magellan TV, to whom I lost many hours of my previous weekend. But coming back around to linen, we first have to really understand what defines linen, because unlike some of our other fibers, it's a little bit more complicated. Linen itself can be actually more than one particular plant. Both flax and hemp count as linen. And part of the reason for this is because flax and hemp as plants are incredibly similar once you process their fibers. Are there technically slight differences between the two? Yes, but really they are almost indiscernibly different when it comes to how we deal with them as a textile. I linked an article down below that goes into some of the comparisons of the two, but really one of the only differences is that hemp has slightly less cellulosic fiber in it than flax does. Cellulose is what makes up a lot of our plant-based fibers. So cotton is also a cellulosic fiber, flax and hemp are, and then rayon is as well, as we will get to in the future. Basically, the thing here is that you as a consumer dealing with fabric and fibers are not really going to notice a difference. I personally have found that very often you will see flax linen on the finer side and hemp linen used for things like ropes and canvas and heavy fabrics. This isn't because one is heavier than the other or finer than the other or longer or anything. This just seems to be our cultural mindset of hemp being a strong thing. This may also have something to do with where these things are grown and the restrictions on them, because in the United States, we actually weren't able to grow hemp for a very long time. We're only just now starting to be able to grow it again for the purposes of textiles. Now, I do have to specify, the hemp textile that we are talking about is not the same as that hemp. They are close species, but have a very different element to them. So there's no concerns in growing textile-based hemp. It's actually likely that it was restricted from being grown, not because of its controversial nature, but because that was the point where the cotton industry was really pushing hard to get rid of its competition. So thankfully, we're coming back around to being able to grow that because it is such a useful industrial fiber. So now that we understand that flax and hemp are very close in relationship, but slightly different plants, what exactly are they and how do we get fibers out of them? So they are very long, tall plants. They have long stalks. The seeds are at the top, and so it needs to be able to pull moisture out of what is preferably a very fertile but well-drained soil and carry it all the way up through this very long plant in order to reach its seeds at the top and manage to propagate and survive. So for us, that turns out very well because that internal structure, the bast structure, meaning that it pulls the moisture all the way up that long distance, makes for wonderful fibers if we can get to them. And the process of actually producing linen from the flax or the hemp plant is rather intensive, and that's one of the reasons why it can be somewhat expensive today and isn't necessarily mechanized in the same way that cotton as an industry became eventually. So the process starts with these very long plants that are either cut or pulled up from the ground, allowed to dry, and then they start the process of what's called rippling, where they remove all the seeds at the top because those seeds are useful in many different ways. Linseed is something that we are familiar with in terms of food, and later removing the oil from the stalks as well. So this plant produces far more than just linen. But they remove those seeds, and then they go through a process of needing to separate out all of those fibers on the inside. They are really sort of glued and clumped together by pectin. And in order to remove the pectin, you can go through a chemical process that we now know how to do, but that can be damaging to the fibers, and it's not environmentally friendly. So a lot of places still use the older format of retting. Retting is a process in which they use bacteria to break down that sticky pectin. This can be done by laying it out in the fields and allowing it to essentially rot in a slow and natural format. You can also speed this up and regulate it a little bit better by way of large pools or other bodies of water where it helps feed the process. This is something that takes a few days. If you leave it in there for too long, the whole thing rots away and you've lost all of your fibers. So it's a very closely maintained process. From there, they sort of break open that outer shell to get to those fibers, clear away all of that extra exterior. They also clear away at this point some of the shorter fibers, which are less ideal. Those are called tow. And tow fibers are very short, sometimes curly or a little more shaggy, and this is where the term tow-headed comes from, if you've ever heard that in reference to someone with curly blonde hair. So that is where that term comes from, and the longer fibers, the line or lean, I've heard it pronounced both ways, are what is more ideal for creating a really fine linen textile. The tow fibers can still be made into textiles, and they regularly are used. They are not thrown out, but ideally you want the longest, strongest, smoothest fibers to come out of this plant. That particular process is called scutching. From there, we then move on to heckling, and heckling is actually taking those fibers and combing them through a wire comb, so that way it removes all of the final little pieces that you don't want in there. It lays all the fibers out nice and straight, and it honestly ends up looking a fair bit like blonde hair by the end. So it's a somewhat lengthy and intensive process, but it produces an incredibly useful textile. The fibers that you end up with at the end are anywhere from 1 to 6 inches, or I believe that is 25 to 150 millimeters in length. So they can get fairly long. They are just long staple fibers, which is the terminology that we use for specifically short fibers in comparison to the long filament fibers that are usually man-made or are things like silk. In addition to the different weaves and different finishing processes that create different textiles for linen, you also have the actual dyeing process, which can be surprisingly unique to linen. Not only can you, of course, dye the textile in many different ways and achieve very vibrant colors even from natural dyes, but linen is very often left in a natural state that we call unbleached, meaning that it has sort of this very soft, warm gray tone. And that's something that is considered desirable. Many other natural textiles do not often use their natural colors as a thing you can find regularly, while linen does. And even with the unbleached natural state, there are different levels of bleaching, whether it's fully bleached to a brighter white or half bleached in between. And these processes can be done by way of chemicals, but were also historically done in numerous different ways that included things like buttermilk and laying things out on top of the grass to sun and bleach out. So linen will naturally bleach in the sun and can do so very easily if you give it a little bit of extra encouragement. This means that this is a textile that can have less environmental impact in terms of its actual dyeing and finishing process, because you can get undyed linens or even unbleached linens that haven't gone through the same level of chemical processing that almost all of the other textiles you tend to encounter do. Now, for the history of linen, we have to go really, really far back, and there is way more in this history than I could possibly fit into one video. I have linked an article and a book below that both go into this in a lot more depth than I can manage, but the really simple history of linen is that it is an ancient textile. We have evidence of it being woven into a textile format as of at least 30,000 years ago. Just crazy to think how far back that goes. And that particular find is in present day Georgia. So there is a lot of evidence of linen being used throughout Europe and of course Egypt and other regions all over the world very, very far back in history. And it was not only a useful textile, but it was something that was incredibly important on a social level, especially when you look at cultures like ancient Egypt, where linen was something that was not only worn every day, but it was something that had a great deal of cultural importance to them in terms of how they prepared their dead. And linen became something beyond just a regular everyday fabric in those situations, and the amount of variety that you see in terms of the fineness and the usefulness of linen is just massive. This is a textile that has many different uses. It doesn't go through nearly as many renditions and fancy weaves and crazy things as some of our other textiles. Yes, there are going to be different weaves, which give us different names. For different linen textiles, there are some very distinct finishes that we're going to also talk about, but linen itself is inherently incredibly useful. Part of this is because it stays cool even in hot environments. So linen is the ideal textile for any place that you are dealing with difficult hot weather. And on top of this, because it is a bast fiber, it was made to take moisture and wick it away and evaporate it up into the top of the plant. So guess what it does with your own body moisture? Right, it is perfect to wear when you are hot and sweaty. It also does not have a tendency to hold smell and other issues like that. So there is a reason why linen throughout thousands of years of history was used very commonly, not only in hot climates, but as an undergarment. It's something that does very well up against the skin. It's something that can be washed very hard. It's very durable, and it's easy to bleach and to manage cleanliness very well. So that is why you will regularly see shirts, shifts, chemises, smocks, all of the undergarments that go right up against the body are very often made out of a bleached linen throughout a lot of history. It's just plain useful. It's by far my favorite textile for summer wear, and thankfully it is becoming more and more popular again today. We sort of forgot about it for a while there, but it's coming back in again. Part of the reason why it was sort of pushed to the side is because it has a reputation for being hard to care for. This is only partially true. It's actually fairly easy to care for in the sense that it is very washable. It's better to wash it cold than hot. It will shrink a little bit the first time it is washed, but unless you're washing it regularly on a hot cycle, it's not likely to continue shrinking much from there. Wash it in cold, you'll be good to go. You'll also find it recommended that you don't dry it fully in the dryer. You can dry it on a low heat, and the best way to do that is then take it out of the dryer just before it is fully dry and iron it then. It's very easy to iron out the wrinkles that can be left in the dryer if you are doing it that way, as long as it's not fully dry yet. So that is a really big tip in caring for your linen garments and managing to wash them and launder them, but still have them look really nice once you are done laundering them. Yes, linen can wrinkle as you wear it, and that is part of a problem with the fact that the fiber is not very elastic. It isn't meant to be bent and crinkled, it's meant to be long and straight. It really prefers that system, and it can break over time and create little wrinkles. Now, the better your fibers are, the less broken down they are, the longer that staple fiber is, the less wrinkling you're going to get. So it is a matter of quality. Higher quality linens that use the best parts of the fibers, are actually going to wrinkle a little bit less than the cheaper quality tow fibers. So there is a range of qualities when it comes to linen, and there are certain regions today that are incredibly well known for their very high quality production of linen. Ireland is a great example of that. They have an amazing linen industry up there, and that is something I highly recommend. If you have any interest in linen or that area of the world, look into that. The industry up there and what they have done to make sure that it survives and continues is just so neat. There are other places that you regularly find linen produced today as well, such as in Southeast Europe. Historically, Germany also regularly produced a lot of linen. Today, you will very commonly see Lithuania come up as one of the places that it is regularly produced. Linen is a great option in many ways if you want a very environmentally friendly textile in comparison to lots of the other options. Yes, it is not always produced environmentally friendly. Linen production has expanded across the globe and can be found in many other areas that it was not traditionally produced in earlier on. And there are a variety of different levels of environmentalness put into that production in those different regions. However, the nice thing is that a lot of linen production specifies where it was produced and will very often give you a lot of information. There is a lot of pride and effort put into linen production in many different countries. And so you get to see the entire story of this linen production from different companies that talk about where it is produced and how it is produced. On top of that, linen is incredibly biodegradable compared to lots of other textiles, more so than cotton. So once this particular garment has gone through years and years and wear and tear, which it's going to take a long time because it's pretty strong, you can turn it into rags, and from there it can be biodegraded and break down in the soil very easily, so you aren't leaving behind a great impact. So linen is useful, and comparison to many other things out there, it can be very environmentally friendly. So if you don't believe that linen is a miracle fiber yet, I don't know what else to tell you, but I absolutely adore it. So let's talk about the different types of linen textiles that you will regularly find today and some of the historic counterparts to them. So most of the linen that you're going to encounter out in the world is just plain weave, meaning that the warp running the long way of the textile and the weft running left and right across are evenly spaced. They run over, under. They're the same weight of threads. There's nothing interesting happening here. It's just plain. This is not one specific type of linen, however. There are many different weights within this plain weave, not only made so by the different spacing between the threads, but the actual weight of the threads themselves. Because you can get what looks like a very fine linen and very lightweight linen by just putting a lot of gaps in it and making it sort of like cheesecloth almost. That doesn't necessarily mean that it is a finer linen, it just means that it's lighter weight. So when you get into the very lightweight, what we like to call handkerchief linens, which is very useful for things like handkerchiefs and caps and other lightweight accessories throughout history, that is something that is best done with very, very fine threads that are still tightly packed. You can, like I said, get a very sheer linen that is not fine. And that's going to be a lot more difficult for you to work with. It's going to be a little bit more difficult to get fine pleats to do fine stitches. And linen is a great example of a textile that makes it obvious how large your stitches should be depending on the weight and number of threads packed in. So you can only do tiny stitches on fine linen, and the finer it is, the tighter your stitch count can be, and really should be depending on the exact fineness of your textile. Now, this handkerchief is at the lighter weight sheer end, and you can go through lightweight, mid-weight, heavyweight, all sorts of different weights of linen. And this will make a difference in how sheer it is, how lightweight it actually physically feels, how it drapes, how it moves. Just the overall density and touch of the textile will vary based off of these different weights. And depending on what you were doing with the textile, you will want a different weight. If you were doing something like a pair of trousers or breeches, you want something that is on the heavier end of that scale. You want something that is going to hold up and be durable and not be see-through. Color can also make a difference in this. Obviously, something that is a black linen is going to be less see-through than a white linen inherently. However, you can get dense enough, heavy enough white linens that they are not see-through at all. It is possible. I have a few of them. So there is a wide variety of weights that depend on the size of the thread and how tightly packed it is. And inevitably, the more tightly packed it is, the more you've packed in there, therefore the more expensive it should be in theory. You good? Okay. You will see some different terms apply to plain weave linens as well, such as Holland, which used to refer to just linen that came out of Holland. It didn't have a specific weave, but we tend to refer to that more specifically as a plain weave, fine quality linen today. Like I said, you'll also see things like Irish linen, which isn't a specific weave, it's just a quality, theoretically, because it's coming out of a high quality production area. Another type of plain weave linen that really needs its own entire section is that of canvas. Canvas is technically a plain weave, however, there are some slight variations on that while keeping it a plain weave that make it function a little bit differently. Specifically, canvas is something that we tend to think of as heavy, dense, thick, stiff, very durable. It's the sort of things that you're used to seeing that make up tents or sails. It is a hard utilitarian fabric. However, there is some fun stuff with that weaving that you can do to make it even more useful for things like tents and sails, which need to shed water. Already, linen is pretty good at shedding water. We talked about that earlier with the fact that it likes to wick water through it. It doesn't want to hold on to it and swell. It wants to continue moving that water through. So it's already good for water resistance. On top of that, you can weave your canvas in a way so that the weft threads running the short way left to right and the warp threads running the long way are actually slightly different weights. You can also compact those warp threads in sort of chunks or pairs that have a slight bit of separation between them. You will see a slight variation, a slight striation in it because of this, and it actually helps create channels for the water to run down it. I spent a few years working on a special project reproducing George Washington's marquee tents from the American Revolution, and we made not only reproductions of his marquee tents, but also common tents, and did a lot of weird experiments with the multitude of rain that we got in Virginia during the time that we were working on this to see just how water resistant this particular canvas could be. And let me tell you, it did an amazing job. Even in the heaviest of downpours, you had nothing but a fine mist on the inside, and it dried out fairly quickly in the sun. You've also heard me regularly talk about canvas from a tailoring perspective, and this is usually a plain weave linen that has been finished and particularly woven in a way that makes it very strong, sturdy, stiff. It doesn't flex and move around a lot. It is just very resistant to much manipulation. And like I said, this can be partly due to the way that it is woven and compacted. It is also due to the way that it is finished, because you can glaze or starch or otherwise add certain types of gum-based things to linen to help keep it very stiff and starched. Within this range of canvases, you will find terms like duck or hessian. You'll also find lower quality ones like burlap or crash, which are much more open weave and have a lot of that spacing. A burlap or a crash is not going to function the same way that a tightly packed tent canvas is going to work. It will not keep you dry. It does many other things, but it's not meant to function in that way. So even though they're all plain weaves, the canvases, the burlaps, and the just regular plain weave linens like I have on are all the same weave, pretty much, but they function in many different ways. So you have to be somewhat attentive to what weight you're dealing with and what purpose it has, and therefore what hand it has, whether it is soft or stiff, whether it is meant to deal with shedding water, or whether it's just meant to be a cheap and easy option. With all of those finishes that I just mentioned, there are a variety of different things that you can do, such as glazing, or as I like to talk about a lot, beetling, which, unlike glazing where there's actually a starch or something applied to the textile to finish it off and make it shiny, beetling does not require an additive. It's essentially taking a machine with a bunch of hammers, and it just hammers away as you move the textile back and forth for days on end, let it rest, move it back and forth for days on end, and it is an incredibly weird and intensive process that produces a very flat, shiny textile that is very stiff but requires no extra additives to it, meaning that if it gets wet or is washed, it does not lose its stiffness the same way that a glazed linen would. So beaded linen is useful as a tailoring sort of canvas. It's useful as a sort of reinforcement, but it's very lightweight. This is also true of buckram, which you might have seen me make in my houppelande video, where you take a plain weave linen that is preferably of a mid-weight or heavier weight, something that has a good density to it, and you apply something like gum tragacanth or gum arabic as a stiffener. So it's slightly different than a glazed linen. You won't end up with this super smooth, shiny finish on top of it necessarily, but they have a lot of similarities in the fact that they are stiff and structured and unyielding and unmoving, and are done so by way of an additive. Moving into some of the other weaves, a twill weave is something that is also very regularly found in linen. Twill weaves end up with the diagonal ridges that run along the textile that are made by way of the pattern of weaving, having some things go over, under, and setting that off in a different pattern. There's more than one exact way to do a twill, but as a general concept, the diagonal twills or the herringbone twills, where they sort of zigzag back and forth, are all under the same family. One of the most common twills that you will find for linen is that of ticking. Ticking is something that it was regularly used and still is today in a lot of upholstery work. It's great for sofas and pillows. It was used as the mattress cover. It's a very, very durable and strong textile, and it is very useful in many ways. You will also regularly see that ticking very often will have stripes woven into it of different colors. White and red or white and blue ticking is incredibly popular, and that is one of those textiles that's kind of around and making a bit of a comeback because of that very cottagecore feel to it. You will also see drill mentioned when it comes to twill weaves for linen. Again, a very, very strong and sturdy textile, which is better suited more towards functional pieces rather than, say, an entire gown or other decorative item being made out of it. There are certainly lighter weight twills and finer twills done in linen, which do wonderfully for fashion-based purposes, but when you're looking at things like ticking and drills, those are more often aimed at very functional, utilitarian purposes rather than fashionable. Weirdly enough, I discovered in the process of doing some research for this that silesia, which is now normally made out of cotton, also used to be made specifically out of linen, and that is another twill that was very lightweight and crisp. So that is a good example of a historic textile that would have been appropriate to be used for fashionable purposes beyond just the utilitarian heavier twills. I have also come across some references to linen crepe being sold by modern manufacturers. Crepe weaves are done by way of the twist in the threads. You can twist the threads as a Z or an S, meaning clockwise or counterclockwise, and if you alternate your rows as you go back and forth, as you release it, it sort of gives a pebbly texture. And this pebbly texture is something that you can find in linens occasionally. It's not terribly common, and it used to be that momi fabrics in the 19th century were originally linen, sometimes mixed with wool. They've gradually become more common in cotton or other blends that don't include linen, but as you might have guessed, momi fabric does come from a variation on the term mummy. So this was meant to replicate the texture that was in the Egyptian linens that were coming out of the tombs throughout the 19th century and were becoming very popular as a type of textile. And they were imitating this with linen in the 19th century to get that sort of textured pebble effect to the weave that reminded them of these older ancient textiles. Another very common weave that you might not have realized is absolutely everywhere for linen is that of the Dobby weave. Now, one of the great examples of Dobby weaves usually comes from your kitchen towels. It's that waffle weave that you regularly see that is very good at absorbing things. And there are variations on the exact pattern that gets woven in terms of whether it's diamonds or squares, different raised areas, but this makes for a very absorbent textile. So this was regularly used as diaper cloth or as toweling in kitchens today. It's just a very useful weave for those purposes, and you can find finer ones that are still very good for clothing as well. So in terms of textile uses, yes, you can find that in clothing historically. One of my personal favorites more recently is that of linen knit. Yes, you can get linen in a thread, which you can use to knit things yourself, but I'm finding more and more actual pre-knit linen textiles, which a linen knit t-shirt, just brilliant. Knits can sometimes be a little bit less even in their overall texture. I have found some that are very high quality that don't have nubs in them. And that's not necessarily saying that the nubbly things that you find in linen occasionally are bad quality. Sometimes that is just a design choice that they want to make. And yes, historically, you were not idealizing putting slubs into your linens, but it didn't mean that linen with slubs was unsellable and unusable. The finer, lightweight linens, if they are nice and smooth and clean, that is ideal. Slubs are much like silk. They're around. They're not necessarily a good or a bad thing. They just very often are a specific design choice, more so than a matter of quality. Which leads us into the concept of linen look. Because you might find when you go to certain fabric stores that you will get to a section of linens that are not actually linens. What they are is what they term linen look, meaning that they are cotton or synthetics that have been woven with that slubbiness to them to make it look like a plain weave linen that has a lot of texture to it. I have thoughts on this which are not really positive. I'm kind of annoyed that they've taken that terminology and applied it, much like silk is something that gets regularly applied to something that has a silky texture rather than actually being silk textile. So definitely when you are looking at modern textiles that mention linen in the title, double check that it is actually linen, not just that it is woven to resemble what we think linen should look like. And there certainly are blends that resemble linen in different ways but have different attributes. You can blend linen with lots of other textiles to get different textures, to get different attributes. So if you blend linen with certain textiles that are less likely to wrinkle, that can help negate a lot of those issues with linen's care and upkeep. But it can reduce some of its effectiveness. So this is especially true in things like cotton, where cotton doesn't deal with moisture as well. It wants to hold on to the moisture, and it also wants to hold on to your smells. So it won't be as good at evaporating and dealing with your body sweat and heat, but it will still be better than plain cotton. Linsey woolsey is a regular historic textile that you will come across, a blend of linen and wool, which means that it's going to have some of the attributes of both. And you will also find linen woven in with lots of other things. Camlets can be a whole mix of different things. Linen can be blended with synthetic or natural fibers to help them function better, and to also help the linen keep from wrinkling and make it a little bit easier care and wear. So that covers our very long bast fibers when it comes down to the basics of linen and the wonderful world that that creates in terms of useful, functional, and beautiful textiles. I personally really like to use them for modern wear. Like I said, they are perfect for undergarments up against the skin. They are also great for some outer fashions historically, but they are something that has to be treated a little bit differently for that reason. They aren't going to necessarily have the same structure that wool does or the same stiffness and crispness that silk does. You're not going to see an entire ball gown made out of linen, for example. It's just not common, even though linen can be incredibly expensive and you can have very, very fine qualities that cost a lot of money in accessories. It is more commonly used throughout history as a day garment when we're talking about more modern, pre-modern European history. You will find it in all sorts of places and purposes because it is such a useful textile that can be made utilitarian or fashionable.